All right. Welcome, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. We've got a special guest, Mark Kennedy, Director of the Wilson Center, Wahba Institute for Strategic Competition. Before that, Congressman from the great state of Minnesota, President Emeritus of the University of Colorado, and former President of the University of North Dakota, which also gives us a sense that he cares about universities, and Chairman Emeritus of the Economic Club of Minnesota. So with a great perspectives on the economy and on international trade. More importantly, Mark is a friend, and I trust that he's going to dive on US foreign policy, which is a topic that interests all of us. Let me, maybe before I pass the floor on to Mark, to tell you that today he is at the head of a bipartisan institution. So I'm sure, Mark, that you're going to be playing this bipartisan role that your institution has. And I know that there is a lot of anxiety to question you about the US, especially on the eve of an election, but we also are mindful of this bipartisan role that you have that is important to keep and to respect. So without further ado, Mark, floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Arancha. Very much appreciate the opportunity to be here. Want to begin by congratulating each of you on being at perhaps one of the finest schools of international affairs on the planet. So congratulations on being here. I have no doubt that the star of the Paris School for International Affairs will rise even further under Dean González. So we look for good things from you. Besides your insightful school coursework here, you have really two opportunities to get additional learnings while you're here, from each other and from Paris. With over 100 countries represented here, I encourage you to get to know your fellow students that will help you provide a broader, more holistic view of the world. And you're living in a city that has long been at the center of action, that has some fabulous museums, and that every square you go into has sort of a history unto itself. So learn from the city. When you pass a statue, I encourage you to say, whatever motivated some group of people to invest in building a statue for this person and giving him this place of honor. How can you learn from their experiences? Do you agree or disagree with them? Let me draw your attention to two statues here in Paris. The statues are Jean-Baptiste Colbert, who sits in front of the National Assembly, and Winston Churchill near the Petit Palace. If they came to life, they would almost be able to see each other across the Seine. Their policies shaped history in their day, and they really are now shaping, their ideas are shaping US foreign policy. So with the rivalry between France and Britain, why would they give an Englishman such a pride of place as they do Winston Churchill? It's because Churchill's courage, determination, and eloquence rallied the Allies to defeat the totalitarian threat of their day. In 1952, less than a decade after World War II, Churchill shared what he had learned from the crucible of war, saying, and I quote, "It is my belief that by accumulating deterrents of all kinds against aggression, we shall in fact ward off the fearful catastrophe, the fears of which darken the life and mar the progress of all the peoples of the globe." If Churchill were alive today, he would say that the number one priority for the US and its allies must be to deter conflict with today's authoritarian leaders, the quartet of chaos that lead China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. We should do all we can to avoid conflict between the great powers that would have a horrific impact on all nations. To the students of those countries that may be here, let me say welcome. I hope we can be friends. America's goal is that our countries can stay at peace. America's path to doing so will be to follow Churchill's precept to accumulate all kinds of deterrents against aggression. Colbert was the first minister of state under Louis XIV. He drove economic policies that made the lavishness of the reign possible. He was one of the Sun King's most respected advisors. He was an accomplished manager responsible for developing trade, industry, the merchant navy, modernizing Paris, and backing new advances in the sciences. His economic theory that encourages state interventionism and protectionism is today known as Colbertism. Yet, even as Colbert's economic management made Versailles possible, did he also sow the seeds of the monarchy's downfall? His protectionist industrial policies to maximize exports and minimize imports inflated the cost of basic goods and created a rigid economic system that stifled innovation and adaptability. Over time, this limited economic opportunities for the growing middle class, fostering a discontent that contributed to the forces that resulted in the French Revolution. America's foreign policy today can be viewed as driven by a Churchillian resolve to strengthen deterrence against the militarization of China, Russia, and Iran, just as Churchill advocated in advance of conflicts with Germany and Italy. Sadly, it also includes Colbert's protectionism. The result is a U.S. foreign policy very different from the past. Both of America's political parties have shifted nearly in unison. Seeking to blunt Chinese economic distortions, both parties are more focused on industrial policy and less on complying with, much less advancing, international trade norms. China has long sought to be less reliant on the West. America is now reciprocating. The result is an increasingly divided global economy. Facing increasing aggression and coordinated authoritarian powers, both candidates will be more demanding of allies contributing to securing the peace. Let's take economic policy. The U.S. seeks to collaborate with China where it can, compete where we must, and achieve Churchill's goal of deterring conflict by convincing China's Xi Jinping not to spark conflict in East Asia. 4 efforts at deterrence have led to an industrial policy replacing America's historic open markets approach. First, ensuring supply chain resilience in the event of a Taiwan or South China Sea contingency. While continued trade ties between the U.S. and China are a deterring factor, Xi would be encouraged to act if he perceived that the U.S. was so dependent for critical supplies on the People's Republic of China, or PRC, that America would be hamstrung if conflict arose. Churchill's advice motivated U.S. government not to allow over-reliance on Chinese supply chains to undermine deterrence. The U.S. government has intensified its focus on supply chains and provided subsidies for domestic semiconductor production. Yet it is a slippery slope that leads from supply chain resilience to protectionism. Targeted tariffs on Chinese imports to encourage diversification in critical supply chains would be Churchillian deterrence. But the actual broader tariffs imposed also reflect Colbertism, or simply protectionism. Trump's proposed higher tariffs on everyone reflects both influences as he seeks to, in part, keep China from sidestepping tariffs by diverting goods through other countries. Biden's steel tariffs and both candidates opposing Nippon Steel's purchase of U.S. steel are both pure Colbert. The focus on supply chains began in the Trump administration, but has been magnified in the Biden administration. Trump's Chinese tariffs have largely been continued and expanded in the Biden administration. The CHIPS and Science Act passed with strong bipartisan support. This level of industrial policy is a big change from the past, but there's really very little difference between the candidates. As America joins China in seeking to avoid over-reliance on the other, countries will increasingly be required to develop authentically separate supply chains if they wish to serve both markets. Second, preventing the PRC's ability to digitally disrupt America's society or economy. The PRC's cybersecurity and national intelligence laws and other regulations compel companies to allow the PRC government to secretly access data. The PRC's recent tech crackdown reflects an even tighter Chinese Communist Party or CCP control over private companies. To avoid allowing the CCP to gain access to information, influence American public opinion, or control devices in the Internet of Things, America has exercised deterrence by limiting Huawei telecom equipment and more recently placing restrictions on TikTok, port cranes, and software on vehicles. Actions limiting the PRC's ability to disrupt began with President Obama and accelerated in both the Trump and the Biden administrations. Again, these actions are a big change from the past with little differences between the candidates. The third effort at deterrence, driving a more interventionist economic approach, is to prevent U.S. technologies from benefiting the PRC's military. With the PRC directing all civil technology in the service of its military and rapidly developing military technology directed towards America and its allies, America does not want to facilitate accelerating this process. To deter aggression, America has recently implemented export and outbound investment controls on semiconductors and other key technologies. Such restrictions began under Biden, but will certainly continue no matter who gets elected. Yet another big change from the past, with little difference among the candidates. These three technology-related restrictions will result in American and allied technology facing increased government scrutiny when sold to countries that are adopting Chinese technology and standards. The fourth effort is to not trade energy independence for dependence. Today, America is the world's largest producer of oil and gas and a big exporter. Deterrence suffers if America surrenders its energy independence and ability to supply friends with traditional energies for being dependent on the PRC for new energies. The U.S. needs to also be a leading producer of clean energies to ensure it does not diminish its competitive posture. Thus, both Churchill and Colbert impulses are behind the geographically restricted energy subsidies and in the IRA Act and Biden's EV tariffs. Europe, a major energy importer, chose to tax carbon. The U.S., the leading carbon fuel producer, chose to subsidize new energy rather than tax carbon. This has spurred significant growth in renewables. Renewables now represent 22% of electricity in America, more than nuclear or coal, and almost as much as natural gas. Given the impact of America's energy industry on the economy and its importance, frankly, in supplying Europe with fuel, and nobody should be surprised that the Biden administration approved more oil and gas drilling permits for wells on federal lands during its first 3 years in office than the comparable period during the Trump administration, nor that Harris changed her position on fracking. Still, American subsidies are sparking significant investments in new energies, with solar growing 75% and wind 11% between 2023 and 2025. And with much of the new investments in battery production and wind and solar generation occurring in Republican districts, and many of Trump's supporters favoring advances in hydrogen and carbon capture, the difference in policy impact would likely be much less than many have forecasted. Let's turn to security policy. Today's increased collaboration amongst authoritarian regimes would scare Churchill. It elevates the need to deter or win a multi-front conflict, something for which the U.S. is not fully prepared. That has led to an intensified push for European and Asian allies to step up their investments in military capabilities. Some suggest that the U.S. should just exclusively focus on China. In Asia, I think those attitudes are naive and dangerous. As we seek to dissuade Xi from acting, the outcomes of Ukraine conflict matters. Charles de Gaulle, whose statue is a short walk away from Churchill's, pulled French troops out of NATO. The talk of America similarly withdrawing from NATO, I think, is overblown. The fact that Europe is stepping up more to its own defense is underreported in the U.S. Given real threats to European security, European countries, not just the U.S., will be encouraging each other to do even more. When we think about Ukraine, Russia seeks 4 goals: territory, destabilizing Ukraine, destabilizing Europe, and fracturing the Western alliance. While a prolonged period of fighting may gain more territory, it extends the period Ukraine and Europe are destabilized, and with rising voter resistance against continued aid, risk splintering the alliance. There are multiple paths to an outcome that could constitute a Ukrainian win, considering the odds they face. Our goals should be lasting peace and a prosperous Ukraine. I note that the Korean Peninsula has been in a state of temporary truce since signing the armistice in 1953. Without a peace treaty, South Korea has prospered for over 70 years. That's just one possible example. Finding a conclusion to the tragic conflict in the Middle East is even more complex and elusive. Here again, a key focus of the U.S. is to deter escalation. Luckily, America is also emulating a third leader, President John F. Kennedy, that has an avenue but not a statue nearby. He actively advocated for engaging emerging markets. He founded the Peace Corps and the U.S. Agency for International Development. That aid continues today and has been bolstered by greater investment support from the G7's Partnership for Global Infrastructure. When JFK signed the Trade Expansion Act, he observed, quote, "We cannot protect our economy by stagnating behind tariff walls, but that the best protection possible is a mutual lowering of tariff barriers among friendly nations so that all may benefit from a free flow of goods," unquote. His spirit of expanded trade with friendly nations continues in bipartisan congressional support for renewing the African Growth and Opportunity Act and for trade expansion measures in Latin America and the Indo-Pacific. In conclusion, America's evolution in foreign policy is real and bipartisan. That's not to say it's the right policy. I hope Churchill was right when he observed that America always does the right thing after it's tried everything else. Because being so far away from the horrors of global conflicts, it's hard to spark adequate Churchillian action to bolster true deterrence. And being so far away from how to tit-for-tat escalation and trade restrictions magnified the misery of the Great Depression, that dims our understanding of just how dangerous Colbert-like protectionism is. The PRC today is more of a peer competitor than the U.S. has faced since its early battles with the United Kingdom. The only way America retains its overmatch that it has long enjoyed is through close collaboration with allies and partners. That is why it's so important that America and its allies find common ground. America's competitive position would frankly be stronger if it resisted nationalism and protectionist measures, if it expanded trade with allies in emerging markets as it pulled back from trade with the PRC, if it coordinated more closely with its allies, and if it led by example by increasing its own defense spending. Let us not back away from the ties that bind us, but lean into them. We face many shared challenges, and more likely we'll overcome them together. Let's find ways to move closer to each other, to join hands in common pursuit. Thank you for this opportunity. I very much look forward to your questions.
Thank you. That was a tour de force. Microphones on both sides of the room is to you to break the ice. Here we are. Someone's going to break the ice. So tell us briefly who you are and then your question.
Hi, I'm Leo. I'm from Texas. I'm an exchange student here. You talked about the U.S.'s goal in the Middle East being to deter conflict. In recent days or maybe weeks, there's been some news about officials in the Pentagon worrying that the U.S. military presence in the region is not deterring conflict, but is emboldening Israel because they know that there are American warships and now troops in the region to deter any counterattack. Do you think that there's a balance to be struck between presence and holding back, or not really? Or should there be much less of a presence?
Well, the presence is meant for Iran and not for Israel. I mean, there's a number of ways you can look at that. One of them is that every other ally in the world is watching America. Does it support its allies or not? And so if we want to have our allies understand that we have their back, you can't back away from a country that was brutally attacked with 1,200 people, including 46 Americans. I think there may come a time when we have to be more aggressive than we have been with Israel for a final settlement. I hope that can come. You know, some hope that we could bring Saudi Arabia into the Abraham Accords and that they may require a two-state solution, which Israel doesn't want. I think trying to push for something like that, I think, is where the U.S. can leverage its maximum encouragement on Israel. But right now, Israel is being attacked from three sides. And I don't think you're going to find a lot of support for not supporting an ally under attack from three directions at a time like this.
If I could ask a quick follow-up. So just, you would say the discussions in the Pentagon then probably are not, either not serious or not warranted about the possibility of the presence being too strong.
There's always discussions in the Pentagons on a wide range of issues, and I think you can find a lot. I mean, the interesting thing you may have seen today is that President Biden decided to put the THAAD system in Israel, which actually puts 100 U.S. troops in Israel. So this is an unusual change, that we actually have U.S. troops in Israel to manage that THAAD. I think that's meant to be a strong message to Iran. And again, it just happened today, so I haven't really been able to capture the full impact of what that means.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ellie. I'm from New York. I have a question. You talked about kind of the PRC and the U.S. being these competitive, being in this competitive relationship, and that the U.S. can kind of lean more into its allies and not go down that road to protectionism, but maintain this free trade relationship. Does excluding the PRC from that free trading relationship by leaning into its allies, does that kind of lead to the breakdown of international institutions that kind of govern trade and things like that? Is that like a slippery slope for free trade?
It is a very slippery slope. And right now, with the strategic competition, every international organization that includes both us and them has stresses within it. You'll note in Kennedy's quote, which was very pro-trade, he said trade with friendly countries. So it's going to be a push just to get the U.S. to do more expanded trade with friendly countries. But I very much fear that the focus on World Trade Organization that Arancha and I both know and love and respect is under great stress with that conflict. You could say that about other international institutions. So you guys in international affairs ought to be worried about how we can weave a way towards that. I mean, one of the ways the World Trade Organization has a path for plurilateral agreements. Hopefully that can still continue. But there is a great stress on international institutions that this competition will create.
I think I have a follow-up to that. When you talk about investing in emerging markets, is there any fear that it becomes almost like a Cold War China or the U.S., like posturing, trying to get investment in there in order to in some way gain favor in that nation? Is there just a fear that the world becomes a battleground in that way?
Well, to some extent, there's a competition there, but reality, the unfunded investment needs of the emerging market are bigger than U.S. and China together. So if we're both competing to put investments there, hopefully that's good. Where it's going to cause a challenge is in the technology front. That to the extent you have a country with Huawei telecom communications that we fear China can access all that data, you're going to see less likelihood that U.S. tech is going to go in there. I'm also very worried that we, the U.S., are doing a fraction of what we should be doing in Africa. Between now and the end of the century, the rest of the world outside Africa is going to have less population by the end of the century. Africa will go from 1.5 billion now to 2.5 billion by mid-century to nearly 4 billion by the end of the century. We'll have half the working age population in Africa. Those cities are going to be wired by U.S. to empower citizens or by others to control them. And that's huge commercial, but it's also huge human rights, and it's any number of things. So on the tech front, there will be more of a competition. We, the U.S., are not playing anywhere near as aggressively as we should be. We haven't yet gotten the tools to lean into that as much as we need to against China, who's placing a priority on wiring the rest of the world in their favor.
I guess if I could ask one more part of that, as we kind of try to set up our own supply chains, I feel like there's a distancing from China and the U.S. as we're talking about. Is there any hope of that relationship being rectified in any sort of reasonable way in these international institutions, or is this the path that is being defined right now? Like, is there any hope for changing that trajectory?
Well, first of all, if it's a non-critical item, we should trade with China. Trade interdependence is a deterrent. Some portion of even the critical items we should trade with China, but we should have an alternative supply chain that can expand. So I'm for continuing to trade with China as much as possible, so long as it's not creating an overdependence on critical items like semiconductors, like pharmaceuticals for your grandma, like there's a few other critical minerals. But right now, I think that what has changed is not America's posture towards China, but China under Xi Jinping's posture towards America. So can it change? Perhaps if Xi Jinping changes, but there's really no path for what happens when you go to a president for life in China, which only creates future risk for them and for us. So I would love to see a reapproachment. We would all love to see it, but that might be more hopeful than something we should really plan on.
Thank you.
I've been to China 15 times. It's a great country. They've done wonderful things. It'd be great if we could be friends.
Gentleman over there.
Sorry, thank you for a good presentation. My name is Eric, and I'm from Norway. I would like to invite you to speculate a bit on another sensitive political issue, and that's the Russia-Ukraine conflict. The war is not exactly going the way at least Europe certainly would like it to go, and talks are being made about a peace negotiations. And I'm curious, in your perspective, what could a peace settlement or process between Russia and Ukraine look like, given the intensity and the distance between the two states at this day?
Well, that's perhaps too far of a leap for me to speculate on, but let me just observe a couple of things. The general view is we want Ukraine to make that decision, not have it forced on them, and I think that's ultimately the best. But as I say, having some sort of stabilization without admitting something similar to what Korea did, so that you can build that economy, have it move into the EU, get security guarantees, move forward, would be the ultimate revenge against Russia that thought they were going to roll over it right in a way. Without some significant change, which from a supply chain limits that we're facing across the world, I don't know how we ramp up, even if we wanted to radically increase what we're giving Ukraine, which has been substantial in both Europe and U.S., how we do that. So it'd be great if U.S. were willing to say, you know, get out of there or we'll come in ourselves. I don't see that happening. But short of that, it's going to be a long slog. So somebody's going to have to make the balance. Do we do a long slog or do we try to stabilize and go for the future with something? Those are all, we haven't been talking about it enough. Everybody's talking about it. It's like that Pirates of the Caribbean. Everybody's thinking it, I'm just saying it, that we may need to try to figure out something short of their full goals that they want to have. I don't want to have to say that, but I think we need to think that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hello, my name's Karina. I'm from Singapore, but actually my specialty is in African politics. And you mentioned Africa, so I wanted to ask a kind of a broad two-parter question on your idea about the role of the US in Africa. So the first thing is, recently we've seen especially a disengagement from France because of a lot of domestic opposition. But historically, the US has also had what we could term a somewhat patronizing attitude towards a lot of African countries that's rooted in, you know, neo-colonial mindsets, things like that. And I would like to point out that the US has not really had meetings or engagements with African leaders, and the last one that was had, there's been a lot of criticism that African leaders were brought there and told what the plan was, as opposed to a dialogue of equals. And we compare this to the recent meeting, the summit with China, where you had 53 out of 54 African countries represented, which kind of shows, along with huge Chinese investment in Africa, a shifting away from US policy. And overall, I want to ask, right, do you think that there is a way that the US can imagine a world where Africa and the global South more broadly is not in a subordinate position? And as the second part to that, I want to...
Let me just, the first one was what?
Okay.
Can we imagine a world that what?
Where the global South and Africa in general is not in a subordinate position.
Okay.
Okay, and then the second part is speaking on the idea of Africa not being a priority. Well, I think that a lot of this has to do with, okay, well, here I'm showing my political alignment, but a very neoliberal global economic system. And I want to point out two things in particular. The first one is an exploitative system of indebtedness that has to do with, you know, private lending, but also with IMFs that have gotten countries into positions where they cannot possibly pay off loans, and coupling that with the climate crisis. So I was recently at a meeting with from the Climate Africa Network, and they're pointing out that at the upcoming COP, African countries are going to be asking for money in the trillions, as opposed to the 100 billion that was previously asked that was not met by rich countries already. So how do you think that is possible given, or do you think it is possible given the many different forces that the rich world, the US, is already facing with Ukraine, Russia, with the Middle East, all these things? Yeah, thank you. Sorry.
I'm not sure I caught all of that, but I mean, when you talk about imagining the future, I say that in the immediate future, is Africa going to be that significant to America, whatever happens? Perhaps not. But in my kids' future and 12 grandkids' future, Africa is going to be a major player. Half the working age population of the world, and we are under-investing in Africa by a wide margin. Is there going to be trillions of dollars of anything coming out of COP? America's deficit is running twice the legal limit in the EU right now, and both candidates have proposals for trillions of dollars of more debt. So we haven't figured out how to pay for what we're already doing, much less doing anything further. So I don't know that you can get trillions of dollars of private investment, which we need to do a better job of activating, and I think that can happen. And I think America is trying to do more with Africa. But the best opportunity for Africa is the new continent-wide trade agreement. For both Africa and, frankly, Europe, having more intercontinental trade with each other is a better way of developing their continent than actually the trade with elsewhere. And so my point is that besides renewing AGOA, African Growth and Opportunity Act, that we ought to make that even bigger and bolder by doing something more broadly to encourage an engagement with the African Continental Free Trade Agreement and do everything we can to encourage and support that. The foreign minister, your dean is very familiar with being a foreign minister. The Chinese foreign minister the new one always goes to Africa first. And there's a lot more engagement. We're building that, but we need to build it a lot more. I am 100% more for much more engagement with Africa. And as you young people that still have decades of your future left, sooner or later, U.S. and the other countries are going to have to wake up to this. Let me just say one other thing, though. Africa's in Europe's time zone. It's a whole lot easier for Europe to do a whole lot more with Africa than it is for U.S. So the same thing goes to Europe. Europe should do a whole lot more in Africa as well.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Good night, Mr. Kennedy. Thank you for your speech. I'm Diego and I come from Uruguay. I would like to ask you regarding the following. How to deal with competitors that do not play with the same rules. In this geopolitical competition that the United States is intertwined in this moment, some authors claim that we are in an era of fifth generation warfare in which technological, informational, and cultural forms of trying to distort the, let's say, the enemy's sphere of influence are intended. So in this scenario, even some defectors in the 1980s from the USSR, such as Yuri Bezmenov, have spoken about this. And I would like to ask you if you believe that both Harris and Trump properly understand this kind of implications that fifth generation warfare involves. And I would like to ask you as well if you believe that the US society understands also this kind of geopolitical scenario in which, for 21st century involves. Thank you very much.
And I'm not sure I fully got that, but if you were asking me, do I sense that there's going to be competition back and forth for those that are trying to tip the playing field with each other? Was there more to the question than that?
No, just trying to understand if you believe, as president of the Wilson Center, a geopolitical institution that studies the current state of affairs of the world, that both candidates of the United States election properly understand the implications of fifth generation warfare, and if you believe that they are, let's say, in accordance with this kind of understandings that the Wilson Center studies.
Well, if you were talking about economic warfare or trade warfare, is that what you were saying?
Cultural warfare.
Cultural warfare. I don't know that we have a lot of cultural wars going on in America itself, but I don't know that we perceive any of this as a cultural war. I think we perceive it that the model that China has used is to have massive subsidies to build up an industry with excess capacity, flood the market, squeeze all your competitors out, and then with that monopolistic position, take profits to go into the next industry to squeeze out your competitors. I don't think we consider that cultural at all. If you spend time in America, we have every culture, particularly in D.C., is part of America. America right now, I mean, interestingly, our high school graduates are, a majority of our graduates coming out of high school are not what you have historically thought of as, the Caucasian Americans. More than half of them are not. And so we're a very culturally diverse country, and we have to preserve that and use that as an asset. So I think this is really simply we view the other sides as distorting the economic playbook in their favor, putting a hand on the scale. And after a decade or so of putting up with that and complaining about it, we said, okay, we're going to do the same, right back at you to neutralize it. That is going to make economics greatly complex around the world. The IMF, which I think was referred to earlier, has said that that will lower the overall growth rate of the world, which is unfortunate. But unfortunately, it's the path we're on unless some reapproachment that I don't expect comes along.
Thank you.
Over there?
Hi, excuse me. My name is Holla. I'm from Virginia, and I was wondering, two-part, but what gives you hope for the future, and why do you continue to work in U.S. foreign policy for a group of people who are going into foreign
What
policy
gives me hope,
themselves?
and why do I continue to work in U.S. foreign policy?
Yes, yes.
Well, what gives me hope for the future is you guys. You guys are going to figure this all out for us. And what I'm doing now, what I really truly enjoy. I have the opportunity, after having done a lot of things in my life, to do what I think is most important. And I think these issues are difficult, complex, and important. And we need people from around the world to understand them and try to come up with new solutions. And we also need to help educate our own constituencies. When you poll Americans, exactly 1% of Americans think foreign policy is the most important issue. And that's unfortunate. So they don't pay attention to it until it really matters. But I think we need to do a better job of educating them on the importance of foreign policies and finding conclusions that can help us avert difficult things from happening and help us find paths to more collaboration. I think one of the most important things we can do is to have U.S. and Europe back in tandem again. I was always very concerned when the UK left the EU because they helped to provide a bit of a bridge between the U.S. and Europe. And it seems on many regulatory fronts, Europe has galloped way ahead of America without thinking about how can we come together. And America, frankly, has always not paid enough attention to Europe. So if we could help find ways for us to work together as a team again, as we did in my time when I was your age, that would be one goal to work towards that would create a brighter future.
Thank you. Over there.
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy, for coming here for the presentation. My name is Niklas, and I'm from Germany. And my question is about diversifying supply chains, especially when you're looking at the semiconductor industry in Taiwan. So, I mean, the semiconductor industry in Taiwan is, of course, very primordial and unique in its extent in our world. So I was thinking about that when we are diversifying the supply chain, for example, with having other locations, for example, in Saxony or Arizona that are being built by TSMC, are we not actually reducing the importance of Taiwan as this stakeholder in the semiconductor industry? And are we actually not increasing the risk of a conflict breaking out about it, because the costs for China for a theoretical, hypothetical invasion of blockers would be lower? So shouldn't we actually not increase global dependence by not doing this diversification?
Well, not being completely dependent on Taiwan would be a happy thought. We're pro-Taiwan, as you know. But even with all the investments in semiconductors, Taiwan will still be having more than half, probably more than 60, 70% of the most advanced chips. And will America ever be able to make the most advanced chips? I'm not sure. So the whole Chips and Science Act was really driven by the military needs to at least have their production done. But even with all the investments that's going on in chips today, we're talking, certainly less than a quarter, something significantly less than a quarter of our own production will be done in the U.S. So we'll still be very dependent on Taiwan. They will still have the most advanced chips. We might be close to them or have some production in that. And so I think this still makes, what Taiwan calls the silicone shield that makes Taiwan a much more complex problem for us to challenge and deal with. I would say where it comes to is you look at, there is the packaging and testing that is much more labor intensive, frankly, much lower margin, that we're having a hard time finding the workforce for the fabs. We're not going to be able to do a lot of that. So that creates opportunities for us to reach out to some countries in Asia, to some countries in Latin America, to be included as part of the semiconductor supply chain for the U.S. There's a second big opportunity here for the world, and that is we're not likely to do the legacy chips, not the most advanced, smallest chips, but the legacy one that still power a lot of stuff. Left by itself, China would be in a dominant position of 70-80% market share in legacy chips. We're not likely to do that in the U.S., so reaching out and nurturing that type of production with allied partners or friendly partners is something that I see as an opportunity for emerging markets that we ought to embrace together.
Thank you.
Thank you, but you raised an important question that this new world economy obliges us to look at, which is dependence or independence that protects? It's interdependence or independence that protects? And it's a valid question, very valid question.
And I think interdependence makes us, it's a very key issue, Dean Gonzalez, because we started on this path of doing less with China about a decade ago, and inch by inch by inch, it becomes further and further and further separation. And when you're not dependent on each other, you are more likely to go to conflict than not. And if you don't have interactions with each other, it's easier to sort of think of the other person as in a negative tone as opposed to when you're constantly interacting with them, which is why I think we ought to have as much interaction as we possibly can. You guys ought to spend as much time seeing the world, including going to China, and understanding what the world looks like so that you can hopefully promote keeping ties that bind.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Lady over there.
Good evening, Mr. Kennedy. Thank you for being with us today. My name is Micaela, and I'm from California. In what is perhaps a more peripheral issue within the broader U.S. foreign policy debate, my question is the following. Given the documented human rights abuses and authoritarian nature of Azerbaijan, how would you explain the continued strategic partnership between the U.S. and Azerbaijan?
U.S. and who?
Azerbaijan?
Azerbaijan?
Yes.
As you, I'm sure, have heard, there's idealist and realist. And I think U.S. has always had a strong vein of realism and a balance of power. There's certainly an idealist strain to that. But we're probably in a world where we need more friends rather than enemies. And so we don't want to be too exclusionary. We want to always encourage people to embrace more democracy, human rights, and all that. But I'm not that familiar with Azerbaijan. I've only been to 45 countries. That is not one of them. I did have a couple of Azerbaijani students when I taught in Turkey for 6 years in a row at their top business school, and that's the closest interaction I've had.
Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you for speaking with us today. My name is Sai and I'm from India. My question is regarding the allyship or the cooperation system that you've mentioned quite a few times, especially partnerships like the Quad and partnerships in the Indo-Pacific region. My question is, have these partnerships, are these being seen through a very military perspective today? And especially when it comes to political and bureaucratic structures in the USA today, is it more through a lens of militarization than cooperation?
And I'm not sure I fully caught your question. Is it the partnerships you're talking about, military or economic?
So what are the specific political and bureaucratic challenges that you see today when it comes to partnerships like the Quad, especially if it's for controlling conflicts that could arise, but through a more cooperative perspective than a military one? Does the USA have a specific plan for, or a strategy for that?
I'm hearing the question as, there's examples of partnership that we are practicing and how valuable they are in deterring aggression or deterring other authoritarians. You see what's going on in Asia under Biden, which is what we call a lattice work of alliances that began with the AUKUS agreement between Australia, UK, and the US on submarines. It also included the bolstering of the Quad, which brings in India, Japan, US, and Australia. It also includes a greater beefing up of our relationship with Japan, increasing our relationship with Philippines, 6 new bases in the Philippines. So you're seeing an array of partnerships being developed in Asia that bring each country in to the extent that they're willing to come in. They're not all coordinated each other, but it does, I think, help bolster the deterrence quality. Clearly, NATO is the #1 partnership in the U.S. Atlantic theater, and I think is still vitally important. And there are a lot of things going on at NATO to make that a stronger alliance that I'm excited about. So, and Canada, as you know, is right in the center of that and many other alliances. Hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Milena. I'm in the Environmental Policy Master, so this is a question about climate action. You mentioned about the U.S. priorities to produce more clean energy.
Just to speak close to the mic. So
Oh, yes. But the energy transition is only part of the global momentum towards more climate action. And so I was wondering, thinking about upcoming COP29 and the ambivalent history of the U.S. with international climate agreements, do you know if there are serious discussions in foreign policy circles about the next steps towards making the U.S. a global leader in such agreements?
Well, let me just say that we're all making progress on it, but we're not making enough progress if we want to achieve the goals that were set out. A lot of analysis have shown that most of the actions we're taking aren't having a significant effect because they're too targeted, and normally if it's regulations or subsidies, it has not as big of an effect than if it's tied to the market in providing an incentive or pricing. One of the things that I'm most intrigued with, and we just were in Geneva with our friends from the Konrad Adenauer Foundation and the EU and South Africa on the carbon border adjustment mechanism as to how do you make that work. It's hard to think about how we can make that work for the emerging markets, but I think I also had an event at our center where we had 6 U.S. senators, 2 Republican, 4 Democrat, talking about the U.S. ideas on carbon border adjustment mechanisms. We and U.S. and Europe are the 2 biggest importers in the world. If we came up with something of both of us having incentives for carbon through trade, I think that can have a very powerful impact on global markets. That's perhaps a bigger impact than much of anything else we could do. I would also encourage you to look on our website where I recently did an interview with a professor from Oxford, Professor Karthik Ramana, that's saying we should account for carbon similarly to how we account for assets and liabilities, and saying that before 1929 market crash, everybody was choosing their own way to account for assets, liabilities, expenses, and income. And when we agreed to a common way of accounting around the world, that provided a foundation for the economic prosperity, generally upward trend we've had since then. Similarly, having one way of accounting for carbon and having everybody account for carbon, counting what you think is important, I think could have a very powerful impact. Those, in my mind, are two most powerful ways you could advance decarbonization, and I don't think they're being talked about at COP. So I think part of what we need to do, part of when you ask how can you make a difference, is where can you find the ways where you can really move the ball forward that people aren't talking about, and try to refine it and define it and spread that word in a way that people embrace it.
Thank you. And the last two questions.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here today and for taking the time. You've been talking, or we've been talking about the US's foreign policy debate being focused on preventing global conflict and promoting the rule of law, and with every reason to do so, as history and recent history has shown. My question is regarding international organizations, as they provide a platform for enabling cooperation and peace. However, not only under the Trump administration, but also in recent years, we've seen somewhat of a trend of the US seemingly disinvesting from multilateral organization. For example, last year, the mandatory contributions to the UN haven't been paid in full, and that impacted the United Nations' possibility to kind of implement their mandate, and leads to somewhat of a vicious cycle in which such organizations are not able to work on their mandate and not having the impact they could have, and thus kind of decreasing their credibility and importance, and then leading to more bilateralism than multilateralism. So I think my question is, how can we escape that vicious cycle? And maybe a bit provocative, but how strong is the US's commitment to the United Nations and to multilateralism, also regarding the needed reform in the Security Council? And should the US, and if so, how can we promote the willingness to give up some part of its relative power for somewhat of the greater good of preserving the credibility of the international system?
Well, thank you for the question. Two things. Number one, U.S. faces its most significant competitor, more significant than anything we faced in World War II, more significant than anything we faced in the Cold War, only since we were a little nation fighting UK. So I don't know that you're going to see the U.S. looking to give up power on any front. I think you're going to be seeing, just as you're in a tough contest, harboring it as much as possible. I think I already mentioned once that there's a special challenge for organizations that have both U.S. and China in, that just aren't attracting the excitement of a U.S. that feels itself locked in strategic competition. I think there can be great hope for NATO. I think there can be great hope for the G7. There are some paths for G20 to make a difference. And there are many functions within the UN that we still, from our humanitarian and wanting to lift up the rest of the world, are great vehicles. So I wish I could give you better hope in that regard, but right now, the U.S., as I tried to make the case in a bipartisan way, is very much focused on competition, and within that, keeping it at competition and not having it drift to conflict.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And last but not least.
Yes, thank you very much for being here tonight. My question revolves around currency, or the US dollar and the Chinese currency, also in respect of the future, and I think a quite recent conference in which China reinforced some lending activities in sub-Saharan Africa. So I want to ask, it is quite obvious that the US dollar is the dominant currency right now. As China expands its cooperation also in Africa, but also in Southeast Asia, do you fear that fear might be a strong word, but do you see that as a threat to the dominance of the US dollar, and also that being a very central pillar of US power on the international stage?
Well, thank you for your question. I think China is probably never going to loosen up their free flow of money back and forth across the borders enough to, by themselves, be a significant competitor to the dollar. What they're trying to do is make themselves bulletproof from sanctions. So the more of their own trade, supplying their own supply chain needs that they can do with the currency, reduces their dependence on the U.S. currency for trade. So and yes, they would love to displace the dollar or take a more significant piece. I think the worry you have is that our deficit is out of control. As I mentioned, we're running at 6% deficit with no sign of it going down, and every sign that it would go up, no matter who gets elected, and nobody's talking about it. You have the president of Morgan Stanley saying that at some point the markets may need to intervene. If the markets intervene and have a bond revolt on the world's global currency, that is going to have a very significant effect on the dollar, and it's a risk that's not being near talked about. So again, this is a good avenue for you to continue in your international affairs studies and go along in our monetary areas, because it's a key concern that I am concerned about. And we take for granted the privileges that having the global currency gives us, and are abusing it in the current sense of our current level of deficits that I think need to be addressed.
Thank you.
Thank you. This concludes the session today. Let's give Mark a big applause. And a little reminder that tomorrow we will be hosting the CEO of BMW to discuss electric vehicles, which is at the heart of the intersection between security, sustainability, and competitiveness. And with this, you can take the rest of the day off.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. That was